Professor Werner, on our earlier videos, explained how economic growth is directly linked to the way the banking system creates the money supply. Professor Werner, who allocates the money supply?
Well, as it turns out, in our economic system, the decision is made not by the government, not by the central bank, but by bank staff, employees of the banks, because the banking system creates 97% of the money supply through creating credit, and that's done by the loan officers who give loans, they extend loans. They make this decision. But of course they make this decision based on what suits them and their bank. And they don't think about what's good for the economy, or they don't even think about, well, should we extend the quantity of credit now, or should we reduce it? So each bank, of course, looks after its own interests. And the idea is that everyone looking after their own interests will add up to the greater good. Okay. Well, unfortunately, this is not happening.
So what could the government do to ensure sustainable growth happens within the existing banking system?
There's quite a lot that can be done without changing too much. In a way, what you need is a system of sticks and carrots. It's all about incentives. If you give the bank managers and loan officers the right incentives to create the right amount of credit that the government thinks is good for the economy, and also the right type of credit, and we can later talk about that, it can be done. They will respond. If you've got the right carrots and sticks, they will say, all right, here it is, here's the money.
But quite an extreme measure to direct the banks into the type of credit they should create, I would suggest.
Well, actually, really the hurdle of beating the so-called free market is quite low. Because we've seen with this banking crisis these sort of excesses and huge costs that a system without intervention and without direction has.
Right. Yeah.
Now, what I'm talking about is not a sort of Soviet-type planned economy with micromanagement. We're talking about intervention in the form of giving the banks and the bank staff the right incentives so that when they pursue their own interest, they will end up doing what is good for the country, what is good for the economy. So it's the right design of the incentive structure that matters. So basically, there's these two issues. One is to think about how we can improve what the banks are doing and how they're doing it. And the other one is to actually question the type of monetary system we have and think about alternative systems of creating and allocating the money supply. These issues are usually, not discussed. So I recently conducted a poll of almost 1,000 people, just randomly selected, questionnaire. And one of the questions I asked was, well, who do you think creates the majority of the money supply and allocates the money? And predictably, something like 85% of respondents said, oh, it's the government, isn't it? It's the central bank, isn't it? So most people aren't aware what actually happens, that the banks create the money supply. The second question I asked is, would you agree to a system whereby the majority of the money supply is created and allocated by profit-oriented private enterprises? And of course, the majority answered no. They wouldn't agree. So the current system works because people don't know about it.
Right.
This ignorance about it is part of the system, because if people were aware of the type of system we have, they just wouldn't agree.
Right. How would it work practically? How would the government incentivize the banks? What do you foresee could happen to get their credit allocated productively?
Yes. So if we work with the current system where banks create the money supply, there are alternatives, but if we work with the system, then the least we should do is make sure that banks have the right incentives to create credit for purposes that are good for the economy and not harmful, and also they create the right amount. At the moment, there's lots of worries that banks are not creating enough credit. How can you do that? Well, You have to give banks the right incentive, and one incentive that you can invoke is if banks don't do what the government or the central bank tells them, you have to discuss whether you want to revoke the privilege to create the money supply. It's a privilege, we mustn't forget this, that these banks, through their banking license, are allowed to create the money supply, something you and I aren't allowed to do. And of course, for this privilege, normally, when you're granted a privilege,
right.
like a monopoly privilege,
right.
You are given certain things to do, and the banks have not been told to
right.
do anything, and that's really the problem. Now, there's many examples of banks following very carefully the designs sort of conveyed to them by the central bank or the government. We just need to look at the performance in the last 50 years of the East Asian economies, Japan, China, Taiwan, Korea. The core of the East Asian economic miracle, as it's called, is really this mechanism to influence bank credit creation and ensure that there's the right amount and also for the right type of transaction that receives credit.
So this is a proven system.
Yes, absolutely.
Over some decades.
Can be done.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's not a sort of crude micromanagement where bankers
right.
are told
okay.
exactly what to do
yeah.
in detail.
Right.
You just shape the incentives and then you can do it.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. On our next video, Professor Werner will talk about good and bad outcomes arising from money creation.